read the book of Eov, of Job, and the sin of Job is that he's too pure. He doesn't recognize evil as a force. He doesn't want to give an offering to the other side. That's his sin. Sin isn't against God. He's too good to God. Right? So that's like, wow, that's like a Zohar. And there's a slew of other ideas that follow from that type of idea, where evil is real. Evil has an independent existence from good. It has to be dealt with as such. Comes the Baal Shem Tov, evil is no longer independent from good. And he starts telling this in a variety of parables. One example that's brought down, it's a real chassid, you know. Chassid comes late.
I'm a chassid?
You're a chassid.
I don't know that.
So let me give you a couple examples. So one time, and I've heard this in the same kind of parable in different ways, so I don't know what's the real way. But one time the king makes an offer, people should come and see him. He's in the palace. And there are entryways into the city people can get into. But as soon as they get in, they realize there's a maze, and then there's dangerous things in the way, and everybody goes in and they give up. They can't get to the king. But there was a son and lover of the king who didn't let any of the things in the way stop him from getting to the king. He went through each obstacle, one after another, until when he finally saw the king, he realized that the obstacles weren't even real. They were just an illusion. The point being is that evil is not real. It's an illusion that keeps you away from God. But once you realize that it's just an illusion, it loses its power. Now, that comes right into another idea. Evil thoughts. Now, I don't mean evil thoughts. Some people can consider them very pleasant thoughts.
Yeah.
Naked ladies, while you're trying to concentrate on your prayer, they just keep popping into your head. Okay. So some people would say that's a sign that you're a pervert. You're trying to pray to God, presumably. You've got your tallis and your tefillin on, and you're having these inappropriate images coming into your head. You're bad. And in fact, there were many people, they would go off and they would fast, and they would afflict their bodies because of the feelings of guilt that they would have because of that type of occurrence. The Baal Shem Tov said some pretty radical things about both these foreign thoughts, so to speak, and also this idea of self-mortification. But they seem, again, to flow out of the other. The Baal Shem Tov says, on the verse that says, a man shall not lie with his sister, for it is a kindness, the Baal Shem Tov makes a comment. And he makes this comment in a similar theme in a number of other places, underlying the same idea. Chesed means a kindness. The Baal Shem Tov says when a person has a desire for an illicit, in the case of a man with a sister, that's incest, has a feeling for some sexual relationship which is not okay, rather than the person just feeling that they are evil, that they are truly separated from God. Instead, the person should take the source of the love. What's the source of all love? the creator, the ultimate love, the ultimate giver of life, the source of pleasure, and say, if the desire for this thing which is forbidden, which I cannot do, is so desirable and pleasant in my imagination, how much more so is the Shekhinah, how much more so is the Holy One, blessed be He. And then elevate the strange thought. Very controversial. Even the Hasidic thinkers that came after him, for example, I note the Tanya. We're going to talk about the Tanya later in the series. Not right yet. We're not going to really deal with the Tanya particularly today, but we will eventually. Where the Tanya says, oh, this idea of the Baal Shem Tov is only going for the elite, the tzaddikim who've already control their minds to the point that if they have a foreign thought like that, it's one of their followers' thoughts that they need to elevate. But the rest of us, it's our own thoughts. We just have to push it away. We can't elevate our thoughts. But the Baal Shem Tov says you can elevate your thoughts. Was he only talking to tzaddikim? And the Tanya is correct? Who knows? But obviously, in its form, before it was interpreted or reinterpreted by other later Hasidic masters, it meant that you were not evil because you had this thought. And even the thought isn't evil. You can find God in that thought. You have to do a little work to do it. He acknowledges that if a person can't do the work, they just leave it aside. If the person is not on the level to elevate that thought, they should just let it be. Just let go of it. But again, you see the relationship between step 1 and step 2. Step 1 is saying there's a denial of evil being a reality into itself. Step 2 is because of that, the person who prays, who has inappropriate thought, instead of feeling dejected and rejected in their relationship with God, should to some degree embrace that as a way of getting closer to God, because there isn't anything really apart from God. Now, step 3. One of his followers was fasting and hurting themselves, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polonia, one of the main followers of the Baal Shem Tov. So, such a powerful follower that there was contention amongst the students whether he or the Maggid of Mizrich would succeed the Baal Shem Tov. He was the first major writer to write a Hasidic work of the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov wrote in a letter that you're hurting me, and my kishkas are hurting when I hear about what you're doing. And he swears, in the name of the Shekhinah, that Rabbi Yaakov Yosef has to stop right away with this self-mortification, these practices of hurting himself. So the step number 3 is a common practice that was widespread with the Kabbalists of Tzfat. Not just Lurianic Kabbalah, pre-Lurianic Kabbalah. There was already a widespread practice of fasting and rolling in the snow and letting ants bite your flesh, as there were in some Christian cultures as well, that the Baal Shem Tov was totally against. Many of his students, the early Hasidim, who may have already been very spiritual people before meeting the Baal Shem Tov, were engaged in these type of practices. But again, if there is no real evil and you can elevate the strange thoughts, the next thing is there's no room to hurt yourself. Instead, it became part of the experience of the divine to celebrate the physical and material. That's number 4. Now again, number 1, 2, 3, and 4, you can switch the orders, because soon I'm coming to something that might be the core of all of this, which is that everything is God. There's no separation between intellect, spirit, matter. it's all one. But I'll get there at the end. But that might be the core of it. Or not. Moshe Idel sees this as an evolution of stages within the framework of the Baal Shem Tov's lifetime. That at a certain point he got to the one understanding of connecting to God through the power of the words. But then ultimately he got beyond that and was just an awareness of everything. You don't even need words anymore. Everything around you, just see it, know it, it's one with God. So Idel wants to argue that the Baal Shem Tov evolved over time. I want to argue that there are different elements that can both be true. Just because I can believe that God is in everything doesn't mean I need to stop praying. As Idel would maybe not argue to that degree, but would argue that the necessity of meditating through verbal articulation becomes less necessary in the Baal Shem Tov's later phase. So, while I respect Idel's scholarship, in general, I don't really see the need to create these kind of distinctions in a time frame of when the Baal Shem Tov thought what. You know? Yeah. Well, let's get back on track here.
Oh, that was really helpful.
Was?
Yes.
Why was that?
I had never spotted how these ideas are interrelated
Okay.
and sequentially related as well.
Yeah.
Each of them are very powerful. I've been teaching some of them, but not really understanding the context.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll keep going then, because you can keep going with this, like this. So the next thing, and again, as I'm saying, even though I'm ordering them and I'm creating some type of kind of connection, which is the whole point of what I'm doing, you may come back at me and say, why don't you reorder them? Why don't you renumber them in another way? And I'm open to that. I'm just kind of like, I'm doing it on the fly, if you know what I mean. I'm not exactly following his order. I'm not exactly following the chronological order in terms of the years and when the Baal Shem Tov may have taught these things, or when they were quoted from his various students who in later years wrote down his teachings. But it's just to get a flavor for the interconnectedness of some of these ideas. So let's talk a little bit about how, like, celebration with the Baal Shem Tov. So a couple stories will put the perspective. Person is in exile, and just let me make a brief note that the Baal Shem Tov's methodology of teaching was through parables and stories and homiletics, like classical kind of rabbinic drashot, as they're called. But he was very good at telling these little parables, and maybe one of the reasons why he was so successful and exciting students is because they got it. And in fact, we're going to eventually see how he quotes many earlier teachings, such as Lurianic Kabbalah, but comes up with totally different conclusions, even though in the beginning, when I would study the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and I got into Lurianic Kabbalah, I would say, why do we make such a big deal about the Baal Shem Tov? He's just quotes Lurianic Kabbalah here, Lurianic Kabbalah there, and we make it as if like he created it. He didn't. The Ari created these ideas. Like the biggest teaching about the Baal Shem Tov and prayer is based on the Lurianic idea. But we'll see that what the Baal Shem Tov did with it may be the very opposite of what the Ari actually envisioned. So, where it came from and where it's going are not necessarily the same place. But the Baal Shem Tov may have actually seen himself as totally indebted to Lurianic understanding, even if an academic view would understand them as being opposed to each other on some level. As Shlomo Kalbach would say, that when he gets an idea when he's reading one particular teacher's writings, even if the idea is the opposite of what he's reading, he'll quote that rabbi, because that's where he got the idea from. It's very interesting. But let's get back into this story, this little parable. The parable is that there's a son of a king and queen who's sent into exile and totally in a place where nobody knows his parents, and unfortunately he yearns for them, but it's a terrible situation. And then one day, after many years in this exile, he gets a notice, and the notice says, whatever it was he had done is forgiven. The king is saying, I'm coming to get you. It's all, the exile is finished.